Okay, so this lesson is looking at social inequality. Again, this is part and parcel of the second part of your paper 2 for your A-level. And today's focus is going to be about globalisation and the role of globalisation within social inequality. So whilst we look at social inequality in the UK as a predominant concern for the course, you do have to understand that this fits within the context of global social inequality. So this links very nicely to your globalisation and media topic that you do for year 13. So try and sort of make the connections backwards and forwards when we get to that topic, and make the connections here that actually when we talk about poverty, whether it is relative deprivation, whether it is child poverty rates, all those different things, they fit not only within the UK but on a global level. So ultimately we're going to have a look at how globalisation has had an impact on social inequalities. So we'll touch on things like Nike sweatshops and how different countries have a stronger influence. Again, make the connections back to your socialisation, culture and identity sections. Think about things like consumer culture, global culture, right? McDonaldization, Disneyfication, all of those key things form a part of how globalisation has impacted on inequalities and the issues faced by people in a country and also across countries.
For much of wealth and power between societies on Earth were poor, poverty was the norm for everyone. But obviously that's not the case anymore. Just as you find stratification among socioeconomic classes within a society like the United States, across the world you also see a pattern of global stratification, with inequalities in wealth and power between societies. So what made some parts of the world develop faster, economically speaking, than others? How you explain the differences in socioeconomic status among the world's societies depends, of course, on which paradigm you're using to view the world. One of the two main explanations for global stratification is modernization theory, and it comes from the structural functionalist approach. This theory frames global stratification as a function of technological and cultural differences between nations, and it specifically pinpoints two historical events that contributed to Western Europe developing at a faster rate than much of the rest of the world. The first event is known as the Columbian Exchange. This refers to the spread of goods, technology, education, and diseases between the Americas and Europe after Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas. And if you want to learn more about that, we did a whole world history episode about it. This exchange worked out pretty well for the European countries. They gained agricultural staples like potatoes and tomatoes, which contributed to population growth and provided new opportunities for trade, while also strengthening the power of the merchant class. But the Columbian Exchange worked out much less well for Native Americans, whose populations were ravaged by the diseases brought from Europe. It's estimated that in the 150 years following Columbus's first trip, over 80% of the Native American population died due to diseases such as smallpox and measles. The second historical event is the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century. We've mentioned this before, and there are a couple world history episodes that you can check out for more detail, but this is when new technologies like steam power and mechanization allowed countries to replace human labor with machines and increase productivity. The Industrial Revolution at first only benefited the wealthy in Western countries, but industrial technology was so productive that it gradually began to improve standards of living for everyone. Countries that industrialized in the 18th and 19th century saw massive improvements in their standards of living, and countries that didn't industrialize lagged behind. The thing to note here is that modernization theory rests on the idea that affluence could have happened to anyone, but of course it didn't. So why didn't the Industrial Revolution take hold everywhere? Well, modernization theory argues that the tension between tradition and technological change is the biggest barrier to growth. A society that's more steeped in family systems and traditions may be less willing to adopt new technologies and the new social systems that often accompany them. Why did Europe modernize? The answer goes back to Max Weber's ideas about the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant Reformation primed Europe to take on a progress-oriented way of life in which financial success was a sign of personal virtue and individualism replaced communalism. This is the perfect breeding ground for modernization. And according to American economist Walt Rostow, modernization in the West took place, as it always tends to, in 4 stages. First, the traditional stage refers to societies that are structured around small, local communities, with production typically getting done in family settings. Because these societies have limited resources and technology, most of their time is spent laboring to produce food, which creates a strict social hierarchy. Think feudal Europe or early Chinese dynasties. Tradition rules how a society functions. What your parents do is what their parents did, and what you'll do when you grow up too. But as people begin to move beyond doing what's always been done, a society moves into Rostow's second stage, the takeoff stage. Here, people begin to use their individual talents to produce things beyond the necessities, and this innovation creates new markets for trade. In turn, greater individualism takes hold, and social status is more closely linked with material wealth. Next, nations begin what Rostow called the drive to technological maturity, in which technological growth of the earlier periods begins to bear fruit in the form of population growth, reductions in absolute poverty levels, and more diverse job opportunities. Nations in this phase typically begin to push for social change along with economic change, like implementing basic schooling for everyone and developing more democratic political systems. The last stage is known as high mass consumption, when your country is big enough that production becomes more about wants than needs. Many of these countries put social support systems in place to ensure that all of their citizens have access to basic necessities. So the TLDR version of modernization theory is that if you invest capital in better technologies, they'll eventually raise production enough that there will be more wealth to go around and overall well-being will go up. And rich countries can help other countries that are still growing by exporting their technologies in things like agriculture, machinery, and information technology, as well as providing foreign aid. But critics of modernization theory argue that in many ways, it's just a new name for the idea that capitalism is the only way for a country to develop. These critics point out that even as technology has improved throughout the world, a lot of countries have been left behind. And they argue that modernization theory sweeps a lot of historical factors under the rug when it explains European and North American progress. Countries like the US and the UK industrialized from a position of global strength during a period when there were no laws against slavery or concerns about natural resource depletion. And some critics also point out that Rostow's markers are inherently Eurocentric, putting an emphasis on economic progress. But that isn't necessarily the only standard to aspire to. After all, economic progress often includes downsides, like the environmental damage done by industrialization and the exploitation of cheap or free labor. Finally, critics of modernization theory also see it as blaming the victim. In this view, the theory essentially blames poor countries for not being willing to accept change, putting the fault on their cultural values and traditions, rather than acknowledging that outside forces might be holding back those countries. This is where the second theory of global stratification comes in. Rather than focusing on what poor countries are doing wrong, dependency theory focuses on how poor countries have been wronged by richer nations. This model stems from the paradigm of conflict theory, and it argues that the prospects of both wealthy and poor countries are inextricably linked. This theory argues that in a world of finite resources, we can't understand why rich nations are rich without realizing that those riches came at the expense of another country being poor. In this view, global stratification starts with colonialism, and it's where we'll start today's thought bubble. Starting in the 1500s, European explorers spread throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia, claiming lands for Europe. At one point, Great Britain's empire covered about 1/4 of the world. The United States, which began as colonies themselves, soon sprawled out through North America and took control of Haiti, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, the Hawaiian Islands, and parts of Panama and Cuba. With colonialism came exploitation of both natural and human resources. The transatlantic slave trade followed a triangular route between Africa, the American and Caribbean colonies, and Europe. Guns and factory-made goods were sent to Africa in exchange for slaves, who were sent to the colonies to produce goods like cotton and tobacco, which were then sent back to Europe. As the slave trade died down in the mid-19th century, the point of colonialism came to be less about human resources and more about natural resources. But the colonial model kept going strong. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was colonized. By 1940, only Ethiopia and Liberia were not colonized. Under colonial regimes, European countries took control of land and raw materials to funnel wealth back to the West. Most colonies lasted until the 1960s, and the last British colony, Hong Kong, was finally granted independence in 1997. Thanks, Thought Bubble. This history of colonialization is what inspired American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein's model of what he called the capitalist world economy. Wallerstein described high-income nations as the core of the world economy. This core is the manufacturing base of the planet, where resources funnel in to become the technology and wealth enjoyed by the Western world today. Low-income countries, meanwhile, are what Wallerstein called the periphery, whose natural resources and labor support the wealthier countries, first as colonies and now by working for multinational corporations under neocolonialism. Middle-income countries such as India or Brazil are considered the semi-periphery due to their closer ties to the global economic core. In Wallerstein's model, the periphery remains economically dependent on the core in a number of ways which tend to reinforce each other. First, poor nations tend to have few resources to export to rich countries, but corporations can buy these raw materials cheaply and then process and sell them in richer nations. As a result, the profits tend to bypass the poor countries. Poor countries are also more likely to lack industrial capacity, so they have to import expensive manufactured goods from richer nations. And all of these unequal trade patterns lead to poor nations owing lots of money to richer nations, creating debt that makes it hard to invest in their own development. So, under dependency theory, the problem is not that there isn't enough global wealth, it's that we don't distribute it well. But just as modernization theory had its critics, so does dependency theory. Critics argue that the world economy isn't a zero-sum game. One country getting richer doesn't mean other countries get poorer, and innovation and technological growth can spill over to other countries, improving all nations' well-being, not just the rich. Also, colonialism certainly left scars, but it isn't enough on its own to explain today's economic disparities. Some of the poorest countries in Africa, like Ethiopia, were never colonized and had very little contact with richer nations. Likewise, some former colonies, like Singapore and Sri Lanka, now have flourishing economies. In direct contrast to what dependency theory predicts, most evidence suggests that nowadays foreign investment by richer nations helps, not hurts, poorer countries. Dependency theory is also very narrowly focused. It points the finger at the capitalist market system as the sole cause of stratification, ignoring the role that things like culture and political regimes play in impoverishing countries. There's also no solution to global poverty that comes out of dependency theory. Most dependency theorists just urge poor nations to cease all contact with rich nations or argue for a kind of global socialism. But these ideas don't acknowledge the reality of the modern world economy, making them not very useful for combating the very real, very pressing problem of global poverty. The growth of the world economy and expansion of world trade has coincided with rising standards of living worldwide, with even the poorest nations almost tripling in the last century. But with increased trade between countries, trade agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement have become a major point of debate, pitting the benefits of free trade against the cost to jobs within a country's borders. Questions about how to deal with global stratification are certainly far from settled, but I can leave you with some good news. It's getting better. The share of people globally living on less than $1.25 per day has more than halved since 1981, going from 52% to 22% as of 2008. Today we learned about two theories of global stratification. First, we discussed modernization theory and Walt Rostow's 4 stages of modernization. We then talked about dependency theory, the legacy of colonialism, and Immanuel Wallerstein's capitalist world economy model. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe
Okay, so that's given you an overview of the history of globalization in terms of how it affects stratification through social inequalities and social hierarchies. Another key thinker who is involved in the ideas behind this sort of global competition is Martel, and you'll come across him again in year 13. So globalization, according to Martel, is the integration of poor countries into a world economy of open competition. In theory, that would technically be the case. However, what it doesn't always take into account, as the video goes through, is the fact that not every country benefits on an equal level. Some achieve a much higher sort of national product, gross domestic product, higher income, higher standards of living. at the apparent expense of other countries. So whilst this process in theory should allow hundreds of people to live in the comfort of not having to worry about food or money, healthcare or education, as you know from the previous video and what will follow, this is not necessarily going to be the case. So there are a number of debates about whether globalisation is a good or bad thing for social inequalities on a world scale. So one of the negatives and a key negative of globalisation is that globalisation is seen as a force that creates poverty, right? So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there's still 23% of people living in undernourished states. The global economic situation has worsened in other parts of the developing world. There are lots of disparities across the countries whereby resources have been stripped, colonialism and so on. Poverty in sub-Saharan Africa has risen from 290 million to 415 million. And yet middle-income families in the United States are 60 times richer than the average family in Ethiopia or Bangladesh, and that was back in 2003. So there is a major difference between these countries. So make a note of the example in bold, and once you're done, restart the lesson and have a look at the next bit. Another negative is looking at globalisation and more generalised inequality rather than just focusing on poverty. So this is where we're looking at inequality not just on a personal, individual, family level living in a country, but the actual country itself. So there is research out there that suggests that globalisation has been associated with rising inequalities across countries, and that poorer countries do not always share in the gains from trade. And one of those issues is that the poorer countries have an abundance of unskilled labour, don't always make financial or economic gains from any trade reforms. So where trade and job mobility, the desire for goods that we want rather than what we need, begin to become the jobs that we pay an awful lot of money for. Computer programmers, iPhone development team, the people who improve, I don't know, computer systems, apps, games, all those different services and products that are not essential to life require skilled labour, and unskilled labour tends to be down towards the bottom, ironically dealing with the things that we do actually need to survive. Farming, food, fruit picking. We saw was it 2 years ago? A lot of the crops in the UK were just not picked. We didn't have the unskilled labour as a consequence of Brexit, which is trying to step away, ironically, from globalised trade. So if you make a note of the example here, the poor are more likely to share in the gains from globalisation when the workers enjoy maximum social and job mobility. All right, so especially when they're moving between shrinking economic sectors into expanding sectors. So the countries that tend to do a bit better in those areas, India, Colombia, harnessing the sort of progress across the globe. Again, countries that don't do quite so well are a lot of the sub-Saharan African countries, whereby the education and the social structures haven't been improved throughout the globalisation process to provide the basics like a really solid education, good health system, in order to give the skills to be able to access a job mobility. So if you pause and make sure you've got that written down. Other arguments are in favour of globalisation. So a lot of theories see globalisation as an active force against global poverty, something that prevents and stops and reduces poverty and gives a better quality of life. So as developing countries have become increasingly integrated into the world trading system over the past 20 years or so, world poverty rates have steadily fallen. Again, you should be, as sociologists, questioning how poverty is being measured here, because it's not relative deprivation. This is absolute poverty. And we know that that is a slightly different type of benchmark. But nonetheless, it has steadily fallen. So according to the World Bank, in the 30 years between 1981 and 2010, there was the single greatest decrease in material deprivation in history. When the population of the developing world has increased by almost 60%, the number in extreme poverty on less than £1 a day has dropped from around 50 to 20%. So there are indicators that investment across the globe, so multinational American companies, Disney, Nike, Primark is another one that factories elsewhere, McDonaldization, things like that, have to some extent brought about wage growth across the world through that process of global trade. Again, if you can pause, just write down that example and then have a look at the next slide. So in 2018, this is a representation of the wage growth in various countries across the world. Now, these tend to be considered more economically developed countries. So you've got in here, interestingly, the United States, all right, which is showing a 1.2 increase in wages. Up here at the top, we've got the ex-Eastern European bloc countries, which are in fact developing wage growth at a much higher rate because they are currently bringing themselves up to EU levels and EU standards because of the EU trade agreements that they had. So you see quite a number of those recent EU countries where development is taking place. You've got other alternative countries, Canada, again showing a wage increase. Interestingly, the country with the wage decrease, shockingly, is the UK. So what this would show you is that actually you only reach a certain point or a certain standard, a certain level of income perhaps, before things either begin to level out. It also shows both the benefits and problems of global trade agreements. 2018, obviously there was an awful lot of controversy with regards to the Brexit vote and the removal of Britain from one of the biggest trade agreements across the globe. So again, as a result of that, coming away from globalisation has reduced wage increase and domestic profit in the UK. So again, you can look at the fact that globalisation was perhaps a benefit for the UK, and it shows evidence that it's coming away from that is perhaps a negative, and therefore globalisation could be considered a good thing. Okay, so that brings you towards the end of this part of the lesson. What I would like you to do is just spend a bit of time going through the following questions in your booklets, have a go at answering those. And I would like you to have a bit of a 10 minutes of mini research activity. I'd like you to find out about trade agreements across the globe. So what is the World Trade Organization? What is the American trade agreement? What are the trade agreements across the EU? It's quite helpful to put this into the context of Brexit. So we've obviously come out of the EU trade agreements. So what are the implications of that for the UK? How do we make trade agreements on a global scale to maintain sort of global competitiveness and those kinds of things? So that's one side of it. Half a page of A4, just summing up what are global trades, what do we mean by that? The second part I'd like you to have a look at there is global interdependency. And this, again, should, ironically this year, be quite easy to discover. We are suffering the consequences of global interdependency with global price rises in oil, gas and electric, global interdependency with the Ukraine and their current situation, which ultimately, they are one of the biggest producers of wheat. So what impact is that global dependency going to have on things like pasta, for example, one of the most staple diet things that we eat in this country, bread, all those different things. So have a look at what different countries produce. Where do we get our sugar, our cotton, our coffee, tea, wheat, gas, oil, how all of those things work together. And do a little summary of that interdependency in terms of how it has helped, because it has helped over the years, but also what some of the pitfalls of that entail, given our current circumstances and how it's been highlighted very much that our global interdependency is now actually causing some problems. So half a sheet on what is trade, world trade, EU trade, American trade and so on, and the other half on what kinds of products do we rely on and what's the impacts of that global interdependency. So first and foremost, if you can have a go at these questions. Right, work through those. It'll take you about 2 minutes. Just quick tick boxes to go right the way back to the start and recap. And once you've had a go at them, what I'd like you to do is just restart the video for the answers. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully you got all of those correct. So the unequal distribution of power, status, wealth and income is social inequality. Stratification of slavery was closed ascribed status. Class, open and achieved status. And the most privileged group that forms the top layer of a hierarchy is the elite. Remember, this is not the bourgeoisie. That is only if you are taking a Marxist perspective, all right? Any other perspective, non-Marxist or neo-Marxism even, looks at the group that has the most power, status, wealth and income as the elite. That's where we talk about elitism and things like that. So be careful with the terminology there. A society governed by people who are selected according to talent and skill is a meritocracy. A system of social categorisation in which all property is owned by the community is communism. And the term used by sociologists to describe male-dominated power is a patriarchal. Okay, so if you can finish off at this point, go and have a look at the trade research and the products and goods of interdependency and submit that on Teams for me to have a quick double check and make sure we're all on the right lines. Again, as ever, if you are stuck or need anything, drop me an email or send me a message on Teams and remember to tag me, otherwise it doesn't ping through a notification.